Solution is better than some other solutions, some sort of control trial. It wasn't something that I know our RCD had planned on using before, but it ended up being something they are going to rely quite heavily on me and the data science department to organize that kind of information for. So that's one example.
So I think of, for a startup, I think of 3 classes of applications. So one would be your core product. I already said, I think there are probably places where you'd like to add something to your core product and maybe don't even realize whether it's possible or not. But core product is actually probably the area where it's easiest to realize, yeah, I want to work with this data, and so I need a data scientist to do something with it. A separate application, which I briefly mentioned, is site optimization or pricing optimization. I know product managers end up doing a lot of that, enough to probably do a better job than someone who knows statistics less. And then the last category, which I think is the hardest to realize the value of adding a data scientist, would be if there's the potential for you to pivot and get greater value from the data you're already collecting in a way you don't even realize. So Jared and I were talking earlier about Bitly. So they created a URL shortener. It's turned into a quite successful business. And their business right now is to do analytics about what's happening on the web, and they can market that. And my understanding is that was not their intention early on, but by having data scientists on their team who can create interesting insights from the data they're collecting, they were able to basically build a company off that in a way that they probably wouldn't have thought of if they didn't have someone doing analytics on the data that they were collecting almost by accident.
So this question,
Using our product, but also just turn around answers really, really quickly. What's the role of a data scientist as stakeholder in product meetings? That one's harder. You know, there's a certain amount of intuition about our customers and interviewing customers, and there's a certain soft skill that you're not going to get purely from looking at data. And so I think there needs to be a tight collaboration between someone who has that intuition about the customers and maybe can form hypotheses, and a data scientist who can then test those hypotheses and say, yeah, that's right, or where we've got these ideas, where can we just validate that those are correct? And so I don't think a data scientist can, I certainly wouldn't say that data science is in any way replacing product, potentially helping a product manager iterate more quickly through their ideas and hypotheses and validating what works and what doesn't work.
So, yeah, I guess one thing I want to say is I'm sure you guys are aware that there's really no hard or fast answers to any of these. So, the role of the data scientist, it's going to be determined part of what your product is and what your needs are. But let me, I guess, give a couple examples of how a data scientist might be a benefit to a product team. One thing that might come up is the data scientist might have some insight on essentially what data you could actually even collect that might be a benefit down the road, and start that from the beginning rather than thinking about it after the fact. Things like click-through paths or what have you that end up being data that maybe wouldn't come up from the beginning otherwise. Another aspect that is important in data science, which can really help a product, is data visualization. So how do you display information in a way that your customers or your whatever your audience is can actually digest it and understand it in sort of most concise, most meaningful way, is definitely a skill of data scientists. And being able to work with the graphic designer or the developers to do that is it would be a benefit of having data scientists in the product as part of the product. As far as the role in product meetings, I think there's going to be some personality differences there. Like Dan said, I think that's a hard question to answer until you actually kind of find your data scientist and find out sort of how they work with the product team. If they have a strong software development background, maybe they have a little bit more say in how the product's actually being developed. They can get involved in sprints and so forth. If they're more just handling the data, then maybe they have a little bit less role. They just kind of talk to the product team whenever they are looking to implement some of the data solutions that they've talked about. So I think that one's pretty fuzzy, actually.
So this question is kind of interesting. So, what are some, I guess I don't need to say it's interesting, do I? What are some things that are really complicated for a data scientist but might not seem complicated? And then on the flip side, what are some things that are very simple for a data scientist to implement for a startup that are actually not so complicated?
I'll start with something that may not seem that complicated, but you end up spending the vast majority of your time on, and that's essentially data setup and data cleaning. So you some experience out there with it. I can't tell you how much time is spent, after you go through the process of actually getting your hands on the data, that you actually get it to put into a situation where you can actually do the analysis that you want to on it. It's tedious, laborious, and it takes it takes some care to get it right. And that's something that isn't sexy. It doesn't really provide any immediate results, but it's something that takes a lot of the data scientist's time.
Do you have an example for something that is actually really simple but seems complicated?
No.
So with a lot of different software, there's built-ins. So if you do have data that's clean already, then something as complicated as like neural networks or gradient boosting or some crazy algorithm where if I explained it and told you about the parameters of it and how you might go about optimizing those parameters could sound super complicated, but all I do is drop them into this function and it spits me out something. Could be relatively simple, although there might be some optimal solution that I actually didn't find if I just use a bunch of default values. But getting a solution could be really simple. Like a single solution could be very simple. So I guess I would say you can make things seem simple or oversimplify things that are very complicated with built-ins. And then I would just, again, argue with exactly what Trent said. Data cleansing is not sexy and very tedious and time-consuming and tears years off of your existence.
Yes, ma'am. What's your question?
I have a question in regards to the data cleansing. I've heard over and over again about that maintenance issue, or so to speak, that the data scientists complain about. Why have I not heard that you could delegate that to somebody that the data science can monitor or assist?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say part of the reason why passing that off to more a data engineer kind of person and asking them to clean it is that it takes a lot of what I would call domain knowledge to know exactly how you're going to do the data cleansing to begin with. So maybe after you sort of work with the data and get an intuition as to what the steps are that you want to take to cleanse it, you could pass it on. But that initial step of actually working with the data to figure out what it is that you need to do to get the data in a state that you can use the techniques that you want to use. Are you normalizing features? Are you dropping features? Are you looking for interaction terms? Like all these things. These are decisions that have to be made with quite a bit of domain knowledge, and the only way to get that domain knowledge is both working in the business and also sort of getting really close to the data and figuring it out.
Okay, I need a data scientist. What do I do now? I'm going to hire one for my startup. It's hypothetical.
So I would start by saying I think this is a really hard problem. And when I first mentioned, like, not everyone needs a data scientist, but you at least need a data scientist you can talk to. Part of that is, to our earlier point, it's really hard to tell what's difficult. And hiring someone in a field that you're not expert in is hard work. So if I were hiring a data scientist and didn't have any experience in the field, the number one thing I would look for is, do you have any type of output that you can, one, show me, something you've created, and that you can explain to me so that it is obvious, that it is useful, and it's obvious to a non-expert that you've done a reasonably good job. That second part is reasonably difficult, but if you find someone who knows a lot of formulas but can't explain it to you, you need to think about, like, is that actually ever going to be useful to me once I hire them? We've mentioned this class that we teach. One of the things that we do is we have students towards the end of the class build these projects that they have 3 weeks to build a project, and they go around and show it to employers. And I can tell you, so some of our students are actually in the room right now, but I can tell you, I've seen their presentations, and I think that any of them could meet someone, not a data scientist, and say, here's a graph that I've created, here's an insight that you get out of it, and you would understand, like, yeah, that's insightful. The amount of data they work with is very large, and they've simplified it down to me in a way that I would drive business value out of. So ideally, you would look for someone who can show you whatever you need done. They have a deliverable that they can show you, and that is an example of that. If they didn't have that, I know that a hiring technique that we used, actually in a place with a lot of sophisticated data scientists, but I could imagine working for someone else, is to give someone as part of your hiring process, if you're reasonably far along, give them a data set, maybe not even yours, but just something publicly available, and say, I want you to in the next 3 hours, create some insights from that, whether that be graphs or give them a business problem, give them a publicly available data set. There are lots of publicly available data sets, and then at the end of those 3 hours, have them show you what they've created. If the things that you were looking for were smart and get things done, you can really test whether someone gets things done by, one, ideally they have something that they can show you, but otherwise, if they get something done in a short period of time, like, what better test that they're going to be a good employee and smart enough. If they can do something intelligent, extract something meaningful out of a huge mess of data that's not transparently meaningful, like that, test that second part. So I think you should look for a deliverable or something that they can show you that you understand and that you think is cool.
So yeah, let me just make sure I'm not going off topic here.
No, we're good.
Okay.
So the last 2 slides kind of go together. It's what are my options for hiring? So part-time, full-time, and then also what are some tips for hiring a good data scientist? And I think Dan covered a lot of it, but I'm also curious, what you guys think.
So one thing I do want to say is, when you get ready to hire a data scientist, take a step back and ask, am I really ready to hire a data scientist? And the reason why I say that is because for a data scientist to be effective, their analysis and their decisions have to be approved and have to be deployed by whatever company, whoever their supervisors are, and so forth. And data scientists aren't cheap; they're highly skilled, they're tough to find. It's a long interview process. So make sure you're ready to trust them. To trust them with the kinds of things that are probably going to drive some core decisions in your business. It shouldn't be considered a light hire. It's somebody that's probably going to have a lot of say in what's going to happen with you going forward. And make sure you're ready for that kind of commitment, because otherwise, you're kind of getting overkill with the data scientists, and they're probably not going to be that happy with their role in your company either. So it's kind of a balance there. And as far as tell me if it's a good data scientist. If you're non-technical and don't have a lot of experience in the field, something Dan mentioned earlier, of having a friend who's a data scientist, I honestly highly recommend having someone that you trust ask them questions, vet some of the things, because you're going to be able to tell if there's a good culture fit, you're going to tell if you think they're intelligent, you're going to be able to look at their publication history, you can tell what kind of skill set they have, get all those check boxes. But having someone say, tell me about a project that you've worked on, tell me what techniques you use, what kinds of issues did you run into, how did you get past those issues, and actually understand what their answers are and sort of what their skill set is, I think that's invaluable. And so, having someone you trust vet that person, I think would be, for me, strongly recommended.
So I said you maybe can settle for a friend for some period of time. At the same time, if you go back to what Trent and Josh were saying, there's a lot of work up front to get the data in good shape that you can work with it and understand it. And then some of the model building actually can be relatively easy. So if you're thinking about hiring someone on a contract basis, I would usually have some hesitancy about that. So one is, there's a big upfront cost before you're productive, and then once you've paid that cost, you can be really productive with that data on an ongoing basis. So if you hire someone and they start to learn what's the format of your data, what does your data look like, they finish a project and then they leave. That's a real shame. You've had them go through the less productive from a business point of view perk, and then right when they start to get really productive, you say, okay, see ya. And then the second part of that, going back to, we're talking about product, there's a large role for them to help you figure out what things can you do that you didn't even realize were possible. Much the same way for most professional services, I would probably want to have an ongoing relationship with maybe my lawyer, so that I can check in and say, like, is this even an issue? And if it is, we'll talk about it more, and if not, we'll just sort of ignore it. I think that I think it's very important to have, if you're going to be doing much data science, someone who you can go back to on an ongoing or recurring basis, who understands your business, who understands your data, and can give you informed answers, rather than having to sort of relearn what your data looks like every time you want a question answered.
So a lot of people talk about the data scientist as a unicorn, with all these magical skills, and it's probably that cat on top of the unicorn that's so famous on the internet. Should have had that picture on the slide. So what are these 3 skills that make like a great data scientist? How do they overlap? And then, what are the specialties in that skill set?
So I think 3 skills are like programming knowledge, math stats knowledge, domain knowledge, and there's not really a substitute for any of those if you're a strong data scientist. So you need to have those 3 skills. Mirroring some of the comments about hiring. So I've never hired a data scientist. I have been in the opposite position. And I will say that some of the tactics that Dan talked about in terms of like what he looks for when he's hiring someone on, like being able to like build a product and then discuss with you that product, even if you aren't really a technical person, you just want to know like how does this benefit our product? Can I get something tangible from what you've put together? I feel like, especially if you're in a startup, getting someone who's a data scientist who has a whole nother set of skills that are useful, like strong data scientists should be able to tell a story and generate not only like information from your data, but be able to describe that in a situation and the use cases for that are applicable to your customers, that are applicable to the people internal to your customer, to get you all on the same page and understanding what you can gain from the information that's in front of you. And I think that as far as like, do I identify a specialization? For me, I think that that's like the storytelling part of this, or like being able to generate an idea that people can all sort of get on the same board. And Trent talked about this with like visualization. That's a huge part of like everyone can see from this plot very distinctly that this is what's going on, and I can tell you like this is how this influences us moving forward.
Yeah, gosh, what are the specializations in data science? I think that different people craft out their own subspecialties, but at the same time, because we've been teaching this class, I'm sort of inclined to come back to that sort of when I think about questions like this. And I know that we've seen students, so just looking at, like, we have a student, Hugh, in the second row here, who I think is like really good with dealing with large amounts of data in a way that lots of very talented data scientists don't have the passion to work with gigantic amounts of data. And that next to him is someone who's focusing on ways to make really impressive graphics and is focusing on how can I make the story that I'm telling as immediately transparent as through graphics as possible. There are very much subspecialties within data science. Instead of giving a sort of a hierarchy or characterizing them, I think that if I were hiring a data scientist, I would start by asking them, like, what within data science are you most excited about? Can you give us some examples of problems that you've worked on? And specifically, what about that problem made it more interesting than other data science problems? And then ideally, if they speak in jargon, it's going to be hard to figure out, did what they just say mean that it's a good fit? But that's a concern in and of itself. And I think that the right way is to sort of let their individual preferences come out and say, like, does that sound like what I'm looking for?
So I've hired a data scientist, or maybe I'm about to, and I have a dev team. I'm a PM, or maybe I'm a founder. And can they work with my existing stack? Or do I need to provide them with new infrastructure? What are the challenges, and what am I going to face there?
Yeah, so the short answer is it depends. Most data scientists are not necessarily like as good a software engineer as a dedicated software engineer, but most of them are reasonably good programmers. If you were starting a small startup, I think it's totally reasonable to, especially if you were using the same. So most data scientists are using Python or R. I don't think anyone is building I don't think anyone in this room is building a product in R. But if you have a website that's written in Python, I think it's totally reasonable to ask them, especially on a small early stage startup, to do double duty, doing both data analysis, building a data product, and then also just general web development. As your company gets larger, the difficulty of working in a large code base grows pretty quickly. And if you had a team of 5 or 10 developers, and you wanted to add a data scientist and have that data scientist do double duty as a developer, I think you would need to, at least in the short term, be willing to have one of your developers mentor that data scientist and as they develop that skill. So that's, I think, the first part. In terms of infrastructure, it depends a lot on what you're doing. If you're capturing a ton of data, even before you hire your data scientist, you probably need some of the infrastructure to handle large amounts of data. You may not have it yet because you're not doing anything meaningful with that data. But I think you're not getting the extra infrastructure for your data scientists. You're getting the extra infrastructure because that's just what you need to solve your problem. Can I work with your existing stack? It depends a lot on what your stack is and how much you're willing to have them pay a little bit of a penalty for working with software languages that they can pick up but are not what they have already had a lot of experience with.
I've heard that at some companies, the data scientists might create a prototype in something like Python, and then the dev team will just convert it and basically rewrite it in whatever they're using on the data stack. How common is that?
For big companies, I would say it is atypical not to do that. Like that is the universal way that things are done. I think that's slowly changing, and there are a couple of companies that are basically building a company out of a piece of software that converts the prototype into a deployed model, but that's certainly the standard at this point. In small companies, I think, for startups, I think that's less common, as you just don't have the bandwidth to do things twice.
Yeah, just to echo what Dan was saying, in startups, what I've tended to see is the data scientists will generally develop the model, and some others are comfortable like Python, and they'll either themselves or work with the dev team to build maybe an API to that model, that whatever the existing stack is, they can call that API and get results back, rather than integrating directly or having a Java developer or a C++ developer that converts it to something a little more robust, is typically what I've seen.
Thank you, guys. It's question time.
So we are a startup, and we have recently hired a data scientist. So she comes from a strong background in bioinformatics, genetics, so not a lot of software development in there. She's definitely working with Python around all those other systems, but our software is definitely centered on PMOs and requires a lot of analytics, a lot of predictive analysis, so definitely a need for data scientists. So I guess my question is more geared toward how to bring somebody that comes from a completely different world, having the skills and definitely the knowledge to be able to analyze the data and create useful, simulations on that data. How do we get her up to speed on this world of project management and product development?
I'll take a first stab. So one thing that I've found useful is to include her or them in as many of the meetings as possible. So the software development meetings, you've got things like that, and make sure she's invited to them. It gives both sort of the breadth of understanding of what the business is going on, and also gets used to the lingo. I'm trying to think as far as other ways to get up to speed. You guys,
Are there any recommended resources or materials for her to check out just to get up to speed on the product? And also,
Yeah, so I can speak to the dev side. I was with a company that we were all doing data science, and they asked me to switch over and do some product development or web development. And I found having a mentor incredibly valuable. I think that anyone...
Can I just ask, so a mentor from the product side or a mentor from, probably not from the data science side, but more of a mentor on understanding the product?
Right, so I don't know if this is true, but I like to think that data scientists on the whole are pretty smart. And at the same time, like we're doing something that's foreign, and so so it's not someone from the data science side, it's someone who can introduce us to this new world. I think that anyone from the outside who would have watched me probably would have been surprised both how slow I was at a new field at first, and then also how much of a jump there was sort of once you get comfortable and understand, like, okay, this is our product development framework. And so just having someone who can talk to this data scientist on a regular basis, and by regular basis I mean likely even like a few times a day, just saying, can I see what you're doing, and touching base frequently, I think will get them up to speed quickly. And we talked about, I think Jared asked about resources, and I'm going to sort of punt on that because I think actually the in-person, how it relates to your product specifically, is just so much more important. And resources, the internet has 1,000 times as many resources as we could ever need. The relevant part is finding what specifically they need to fit into the role that you have for them.
Can telling a story be taught?
I think the answer is yes. There are a bunch of books on it. I've read some of them with the hopes that I would learn to tell a story. I think that as a personal experience, but I think that I became better at telling a story after reading a book like Made to Stick, or there are others. So the answer is I think so.
So I agree too. I think so. I would say that the more that you're exposed to like people who do tell a story well, regardless of if that's from a data science role or from any other role, you can learn a lot from that experience. I know just from mentors in any sort of given situation, whether that's understanding a statistical concept or how an algorithm works, or if it's something related to your product specifically, just being able to like communicate that over to someone else, I think is something that you can learn by seeing someone else do it really well.
Yeah, and I guess I'm trying to question back on you. So if you're someone who thinks that you can tell a story well, do you think you have always been able to? If you're a founder, you've done a bunch of pitches. Did you improve as you pitched more and more and maybe got feedback on your pitches? I assume the answer for almost everyone is yes. And so it seems to me that the proof is in the data of people's experiences.
Let me say just one thing to the contrary, though. I think obviously you guys are both right. Yeah, you can get better. I think there's going to be lots of individual differences, though. I think some people are just going to be naturally better, and some people are going to struggle. And the learning rate for these individuals is going to be different. So you're going to, as you're looking to hire data scientists, they're going to be able to get better. And some of them it's going to come really natural to. They're going to be really sort of engaging and easy to talk to. And some of them are going to struggle a little bit. But sort of just knowing that not everyone's going to improve at the same rate, not everyone's going to get to the same level of sort of confidence and ability is another thing to keep in mind. I think with that question is I don't think everyone can get to be the excellent storyteller that like a Steve Jobs or something like that is.
This session has been very educational. Thank you so much. The question I have to ask, the answer may be it depends. But assuming that a data scientist isn't doing double duty, if you have to draw a pretty pie chart, how are they spending their time on a daily or weekly basis?
Always cleaning data. And so it's going to depend on what part of the project you're on. So in the beginning, whenever data science hired, whenever I was hired, there's a lot of learning as far as what the company's about, what the pieces of the company are, how everything fits together. So there's a large sort of knowledge acquisition phase. After you get your hands on the data, there's this continued learning of playing with the data. So that sort of initial phase, there's a lot of just sort of knowledge acquisition, familiarizing yourself with what's going on. I'd say during that phase is probably like 80% just sort of looking and playing with and getting familiar with the data and cleaning the data and all those things. As the project matures and as you get past that phase, it's going to vary a lot to what the company's needs are. There could be a lot of time spent in meetings with marketing and figuring out how you can essentially how you can better serve the company and how you can actually help the company with customer acquisition, with customer retention, there's going, I'd say for some companies it's going to go maybe 50% of the time for that, and then there's going to be a lot of model building for some data scientists. So after you get the data clean, there's going to be a phase where you're actually running through all these different scenarios with the data and comparing them, figuring out which ones are actually deployable, what the problems might be. And then after that, it's kind of a rinse and repeat. You kind of start the process all over again and kind of go through it again. So you're right, for me at least, I think the answer is it depends. At the beginning, there's a lot of data cleaning, and after that, it's going to depend a lot on how you want to use them, how you want to use your data scientists. You want them spending time figuring out the best sort of optimizations for the data they've been doing with it. You want them in kind of discovery phase, figuring out how they can better serve the company and what other sort of avenues you might be able to use them with in whatever field you guys are in.
Yeah, so I think it varies between productive data scientists and unproductive data scientists. So an unproductive data scientist might spend 40% of their time cleaning the data and 60% of their time complaining about how much time they spend cleaning the data. Actually, I didn't have anything else to say. I just wanted to get that joke in. No, more seriously, I think that so a lot of my experience has been in consulting. And I know other people who are embedded in full-time data scientists working for a company. And I know that the way we spend our time varies a ton. And that suggests to me that you need to be really careful about characterizing how data scientists spend their time, because it's going to vary a lot between, I know some people who spend 0% of their time in PowerPoint. I've probably historically spent 20% of my time in PowerPoint. It just varies a ton. Are you in a company that is doing basically research, solving the same problem, trying to find little tweaks that would do slightly better? If you were working at Pandora and your job was to improve how they would choose what song to play next, that data's already been cleaned. You're probably spending an immense amount of time doing just programming and math, and maybe a little bit of your time talking to your colleagues. If you are at a small stage startup and you're one of the things you're asked to do is how can we improve our product, how can we validate that the beliefs we have about our customers are accurate, you're going to spend a ton of your time just talking to people. So it's really hard to characterize.
So similarly, my role as a data scientist has been mostly in consulting, and so I've had the benefit of not going through the cleansing phase very often. Like usually the data is already pretty clean, and so a large part of my role is like automation of whatever analysis we're going to do. So you build something so that someone else can just click a button and it gives you the answer every time. So I drop in a new data set and it's automatically just going to generate this report for you. You only have to click the button every time you get a new set of data, and your role as the data scientist is building the infrastructure to make that happen. But alternatively, if you came in at an earlier stage, you might not do any of that. And another consulting role, it was in marketing, and so a lot of my time was spent in PowerPoint and like making presentations regarding like doing a lot of mapping. So build a map of where our customers are, who's buying, what types of platforms are they using. That data was really clean. The project was actually pretty simple, but it was like showing internal to the company, look, these are the places where people are buying from. This is how frequently they're buying. These are the demographics of those individuals. And so it can vary quite a bit, because that was more, I spent a majority of my time speaking to people in that role and like telling them like, this is what's happening. Whereas in the other, when I was building infrastructure, it's just like you sit there at your desk and you're writing code. Whereas if you're doing cleaning, you spend 40% of your time at a desk cleaning and 60% walking around and talking to your coworkers about how you're cleaning. So.
So I'm involved in the same startup with Val here. We're happy to have scientists on staff, excited this is more of an opinion question based on, well, I get it, how you sustain data marketing and cleansing, we won't touch on that. We're going to reverse it, but it's an opinion question. We hear some of the things that come out of our mouth, and it's like magic, rainbows and unicorns, what we can do with our data. And, you know, the product's going to be accelerated into like universal proportions of domination. But we don't know what we don't know. So we don't know if we don't have the data. So reverse the time spent question. Is it productive to have your data scientists basically iterate through their experiments by inventing things you don't have, and then coming back and say, listen, the product needs to do this?
Yes, absolutely. You're talking to three people with academic background as well, so there's going to be a fair amount of, probably belief in science and things like that. But I believe in basic research. I think that that's one of the ways that, especially startups or well-established companies, are going to grow and sort of dominate whatever field they're in, instead of just concentrating on don't want to boil the ocean, of course, but having someone that has the ability to come up with things that are magical and present them to you, and then you can vet them, you can A/B test them, you can do things like that. I think that's a very good use of your data scientist time, and it also help them. If they're a new data scientist, that's one good way to get them sort of invested in your company and understand what your problems are and what's going on. That's going to help their mindset sort of wrap around the kinds of things that you want to accomplish. I think that's a very good use of time personally.
To avoid data cleansing pain later, do you have just like a couple of tips that you could give us in terms of what we could do proactively so that down the road we won't be feeling that pain, or our data scientists won't be feeling that pain?
So depending on your market, if you're doing anything where you're gaining information about customers, doing forced response for everything is always nice.
Well, that's good. That's something that yesterday's
Because then there's no NAs.
Don't put yellow on white. So something like that is super.
Yeah, so if you can do a forced response on stuff, that's nice. And but then there's the hit of like, if you do forced response, then no one responds to all of your questions, so everything gets thrown out, and then your data scientist doesn't have anything to work with either. So I'm not sure off the top of my head.
If it's possible to avoid free-form responses, is also, there's some powerful textual analysis you can do to get, sort of semantic meaning from text corpuses and things like that. So it's, if that's the best way to get the data, you definitely do that. But having things in a structured format ahead of time, that the results are consistent, not changing that halfway through, which is sometimes you can't avoid it, right? It's just going to happen. But if there's a way that you can think through those things, maybe with your data scientists or whatever, like how can we structure this thing so the results we're getting back are going to be consistent and in some ways something that we're probably not going to change later on would be something to help minimize it. But
yeah, a change in your data collection, a change in the format that they're working with is particularly painful, so that's the same thing Trent said. The other thing is that it's hard for us to speculate exactly what it is about the type of data you're collecting that can be changed to make it easier. So if you can get someone who's used to working with data involved early on, so they can say, here's the problem with the data you're collecting, here's why it's going to be difficult. So you can change your data collection process early and then have the more clean data that obviously will pay off. I'm actually a little bit skeptical that it can ever be reduced to that much. It's just, the world is a messy place, unfortunately, and we see that in our data.
You mentioned that sometimes business owners will come to you with something in mind, and they won't have pieces of data available needed to solve that problem. Even before we hire a data scientist, what are some of those pieces of data that we should be recording that a data scientist will find useful later?
I can repeat the question. So the question is like, what are the pieces of data that we should be collecting up front to make sure that we have the data to answer questions that might be asked later that a data scientist could use data for? Because as suggested earlier, sometimes you ask a particular question, you think that the data is going to help you answer that question, but you might not actually have the data to answer the question. That's the question, I guess. I don't have anything off the top of my head.
That's a very good question. It's a very hard question. It's going to depend a lot on the domain you're talking about, which we'll keep saying, but it is definitely a theme of data science. My advice is storage is cheap. Collect everything. You can't get the data later if you weren't collecting it to begin with. So anything you can think of that you might be able to store in some sort of textual format or relational database or what have you, I say go ahead and do it because it's cheap to do so and it costs more to have to go back and try to figure it out later.
So I think that's a really good answer. I think it's highly domain specific, and therefore you might talk to other companies or look at what other companies are storing and taking information from, and then use that to determine what you should be storing, and especially if you can store it in something traditional, like a traditional relational database or Excel spreadsheets or something like that, and it's not costly for you to just keep track of that information there. Even if you're storing it in something like a text document or something like that, something that has a nice framework that a data scientist can move that into another platform and analyze it later is really useful. One of the first consulting jobs I did, they stored their data on Word documents. I would not suggest doing that. I would also not suggest storing in PDF format, which I have also learned. Those are not friendly formats for any software. So I would also, besides, it's better to have it in PDF or Word documents than not at all, because at least we can take information from that in some eventual state after even more cleaning than we expected. But storing anything that's relevant based on maybe what other people are doing is maybe where I would start.
Who else has a question?
Hi, my question is, I'm a software engineer at a company who has a lot of public data, and there's no data scientists in our company, but they have a lot of potential for data science. So earlier I recently took the initiative and created some nice graphs, like, hey, this is what our clients are talking about, like difficult things like that, and I was like super excited, but they don't care that much. So what is, like, like the being worded this way, what is the software company cares the most when it comes to data science? Do they care, should I try to finance department or customer care? Like, where do they start when they hire data scientists?
To be honest, I think that the three of us in the front of the room are probably less prepared to answer that question than if you ask like a product person. Really, you've got data, it can be used to solve problems, and the first step is finding what are the problems that our company really cares about. And so that would be sort of my mental framework is what are things that, one, we have relevant data about that. Instead of creating the graphs first, saying like, if I created some graphs and it helped them understand something better, what are the things they want to understand better? And so I would let the question motivate the graph rather than, maybe this is something you did, but that would be at least a framework that I start from, and starting with the product people rather than vice versa.
I have one question. So I'm automating data migrations, like big data. So my job involves a lot of data fetching. And what are the tools that you recommend, like, for the simple, not sorry, for complex data cleaning tasks? What are tools that you found really useful?
There are such a wide, so there are a range not only of tools, but even types of tools and who they're intended for. If you're looking for programming languages level tools rather than something that has a GUI interface, I think the two dominant options right now are Python and R, with the world probably moving somewhat to Python and slowly away from R. So I would say Python, and then within that is a pandas library, which is what most people are using for most data cleaning. And sort of once you get started in that, I think you'll find other tools almost by saying, okay, now I'm at a certain stage of running to a certain problem. If I Google something about how I solve that, you may stumble upon other tools and just sort of learn them as you need them, but that's what I would suggest as a starting point.
Question from one of our awesome students. Here you go.
I want it to be anonymous, but okay. So I came a little late, and I know that Josh and Dan has done some consulting, and I know that Trent has a lot of experience. If I was either a founder, or CEO, or COO of a startup, what type of business insights or business applications can I get from data science? I know Dan mentioned A/B testing. I think Trent mentioned like operation optimization, and Josh kind of hinted on some marketing things, but like, can you guys give me some examples so I can get my brain thinking about, hey, what can data science do for me?
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of our answers today have been, it depends to some degree on the domain. So especially if we go back to, I made this distinction between improving just operations, that would be like A/B testing, my core product, and then thirdly, helping me get insights that may even allow me to pivot in directions that I don't know. That last group, so that was sort of the unknown unknowns, are especially hard to characterize. If we could characterize them easily, they would probably become known unknowns. I think a lot of it is for us. So most people here are interested in web startups. So we've talked about A/B testing, understanding my customers, understanding pricing, understanding conversions. If I am forming partnerships, there's some way that I can deduce from the data how much, for instance, increased traffic I've received through those partnerships. Is there some way that I can characterize if people are arriving to my site from Google? Is there some way that I can characterize what are the search terms they're using? Is there some way that I can build a test getting, for instance, people arriving through search terms I didn't expect, or even through websites that have a certain characteristic? Is there some way that I can build a test and say, can we capture those people better, or can we build a better product for them? I think all of that is within the realm for a startup. Again, in this case, quite generic startup. I've done for larger companies. There's a lot that's in even measuring, for instance, employee performance in a way that probably doesn't apply to a startup. You see a lot in marketing. But for a generic startup, I think it's a little bit hard. And if there's something that is useful to everyone, it's been built into, someone built a tool around it. And so I think the greatest insights in general are going to be the greatest insights that one of your employees can deliver to you are likely to be things that are business specific, as opposed to it being something that is really broadly applicable, that you can't get from a tool.
So I don't have anything quite as broad as what Dan had. Like he had a really broad range of topics where data science could be helpful in making decisions. I was going to say one example that I looked at just prior to this was if you have a strong data scientist, hopefully they're looking into trends and your data at a level at which maybe somebody who's just like building a very simple starting plot might not see it. And one example of this was I was reading that Etsy, basically they were looking at web traffic and they saw that this particular web page had the highest frequency of visitors. However, it had one of the lowest frequency of purchasers who went to this particular page. So although it was a high frequency page, there was a low number of purchasers that came into this web page and then ended up purchasing later. And so their goal was to put in attributes onto that particular page that made it a high purchasing page, similar to some of their other web pages. So, I mean, just taking like small insights and diving into them and showing how they can be influential to a company is hopefully what a data scientist can do for hopefully any industry.
I'll just say this real quick. So a lot of what I do is basically predicting behavior and then identifying what you can do to change the behavior in the direction you want it to go. That behavior could be behavior of a customer, behavior of a person, behavior of a patient, or behavior of some sort of vague system that you want to change the outcomes. I think that's a lot of what data scientists, or at least my role as a data scientist is predicting something that's going to happen and then identifying the business needs as far as where you want that to go and identifying the factors that can get it to go in that direction after you do that.
So we have time for one more quick question. We've got a little less than 10 minutes left. Does anybody else have any additional questions? Anybody? Last call? Okay. Data scientists, can you bow? Come on, thank you.